The first week, he drew, while the ashen grey of winter replaced the colours of fall. No planning was necessary this time. The design sprang into his mind as soon as he returned to his shop. He set the comb on a shelf next to the glass flower, pulled out rolls of parchment, and began to write. She wanted timelessness. He would give her time. He procured texts on astronomy from the Canterlot Library, and with their aid, sketched a rough plan for an armillary sphere. A small globe at the centre, as wide as his hoof, represented Equestria. The first ring, a foot across, contained the sun. The next ring held the moon, the final ring the stars and constellations. All rotated freely around the planet, keeping time with the night and day and changing of the seasons. The second week, as other ponies prepared for the winter solstice, he gathered his materials. Although he could usually craft metal components with his forge, the metal work for the stand and axis required a specialist's touch. Perfection, as always, was the key, and sometimes that meant going to other craftsmen with specific skills. Fortunately, brass was the traditional metal for armillaries, and was very cheap compared to the meteoric iron used in the comb. The third week, he crafted the sun, moon, and stars. Again, the astronomy books came in handy, as he traced outlines of craters on the thin glass shell of the moon, and scored constellations on the outermost ring of glass. The globe took far longer than he expected. He created and smashed 4 separate glass equestrias before one met his standards. Rather than a single sphere of glass for each globe, he crafted a dozen, one for each colour of the seas and land. Blue for the deepest ocean, green for the jungles and forests, tan for the deserts, white for the ice caps. He carved them into 100 pieces and fused them together into a stained glass globe. A magnifying glass was needed for the individual lakes and rivers. He set the separate pieces on his workbench and stepped back to view them. He mentally reviewed her criteria: craftsmanship, utility, timelessness. Satisfied, he nodded to himself. This had all 3.
I'm worried about you.
The glassblower looked up at his friend and blinked a few times to clear his eyes. He hadn't been sleeping well, and his eyes felt scratchy beneath their lids.
What? Why?
You keep obsessing over her, over this thing,
Styx said. He gestured at the pieces of the armillary sphere on the table.
You've made 2 incredible masterpieces for her and she's turned you down twice. Don't you know why?
She has high standards. You wouldn't expect her to give her heart away to anyone, would you?
No, and that's the point. Why do you keep thinking she's going to suddenly love you just because you make this thing for her? What is this, anyway?
It's an armillary sphere,
the glassblower said. He set the circular stand on the table and carefully fastened a wide brass circle to it, forming a vertical hoop several feet across. A long, thin metal rod topped with an arrowhead transected the circle. At the center, speared by the rod through its north and south poles, hung the glass globe of Equestria.
It's a map of the heavens,
he continued.
Each ring represents a celestial body, the sun, moon, and stars.
He tapped the separate pieces with his hoof as he counted them off. Styx gave the contraption a puzzled look, then shook his head and turned to look at the glassblower.
Whatever, she's not going to accept it.
She has to. She said she would.
She lied.
Styx brought his hoof down on the workbench with the word. The glassblower frowned as the component shook.
This whole stupid challenge is a lie. I did some asking around. It turns out she's in love with some unicorn prince. She never expected anyone to actually take her up on this.
The glassblower waved a hoof dismissively.
She wouldn't lie about this, Styx. Art is everything to her.
They were silent for a while. The glassblower tinkered with his creation. Styx thought about what he should say. The glassblower picked up the model sun, a solid sphere of clear glass, with a set of tongs. He stuck it into the forge, and after a few minutes it began to glow, first a dull red, then a bright orange, and finally a brilliant, blinding yellow-white. Just when it was about to start dripping, he pulled it from the forge and brought it over to the table. Styx backed away nervously.
Hey, careful with that. It looks hot.
It is,
the glassblower said. The glass sun was easily the brightest object in the room, casting shadows just like its namesake.
It will cool quickly, though. Glass radiates heat much faster than it conducts it.
Styx wasn't sure what that meant, but he had learned over the years to trust his friend. For several minutes they waited, though the glass sun grew no dimmer. Finally, the glassblower held his hoof near the tiny star, nodded, and dropped it onto the workbench. Styx couldn't help the small scream that escaped his throat. Everything he knew about glass from his friend insisted that the table should burst into flames, followed by the rest of the workshop. Instead, the brilliant orb rolled a few inches before coming to a stop. The wood beneath it didn't even smoke.
See? Already cool,
the glassblower said. He chuckled at Styx's expression. Styx leaned over the glass sun, squinting against its light. He reached out and tapped it with a hoof, setting it rolling across the table.
How?
Didn't I tell you? Unicorns have their magic, and I have mine.
The market started at its usual time, though the sun was only a distant promise beneath the horizon. The gas lamps that lit the streets of Canterlot were still glowing when Styx and the glassblower arrived at the jeweller's stalls. They had borrowed a cart to carry the armillary sphere, and didn't bother concealing it. The crowd was twice as large this time around. Several guard ponies wandered the edges of the market, keeping an eye on the mob. Hundreds of merchants and buyers pressed forward, eager to see the glassblower and his work. The jewelers, previously quite happy to have an attraction next to their stalls, now seemed nervous. The glassblower noticed none of this. Although Styx had forced him to get a few hours of sleep the night before, he still looked like a mess. His mane was rumpled despite Styx's best attempt at combing it, and his eyes were puffy and bloodshot. He would have collapsed had he not been leaning against his friend. Rarity arrived at the dawn. She actually had to force her way through the crowd. Her contest was no longer the attraction. The glassblower's works were. This seemed to cause her no small amount of frustration, and her features were tight with anger when she finally reached them. If the sphere fazed her, she didn't show it. Perhaps, Styx thought, the past 2 demonstrations had taken the surprise out of his creations. Either way, she gave the armillary sphere only a brief glance before turning to its maker. If his artwork didn't startle her, his appearance did. She flinched, then stepped forward, the anger on her face replaced with concern.
You don't look well. Are you ill?
The glassblower laughed quietly.
No, and soon I will be better than ever. How do you like this, Lady Rarity? Is it as timeless as you demanded?
She gave him a final, worried glance, and turned to the armillary sphere. The tiny sun slowly orbited the glass globe, casting stark shadows across the crowd. A few inches further out, a silver moon, glowing with its own cold light, followed in a slower orbit. Finally, an outermost ring of glass, several feet across, hung motionless. Inside were 1,000 tiny points of light, and a dozen constellations drawn in glowing lines.
It is fine,
She said.
well crafted, useful in its way to an astronomer, but how is it timeless? How will future generations remember this?
He chuckled again.
I suppose that depends on how you define timeless, then.
He reached out with a hoof and touched the glass sun, freezing it in place. Around the three of them, the world grew dimmer. Colors slowly vanished, as though washing away in the rain. The sound of the crowd faded into silence, and everything around them slowed to an unnatural stop. Rarity looked around in panic. A sea of frozen faces looked back, unmoving, unchanging. Birds hung in the air overhead. Even the wind ceased blowing. For a long moment, their breaths were the only sound.
By Celestia, what have you done?
Styx mumbled. He gazed around the frozen scene in wonder. Rarity fell back onto her haunches. Her eyes were wide and panicked as she turned to the glassblower.
Put them back, please. Whatever you did, put them back.
He sighed quietly and removed his hoof from the armillary sphere. The sun slowly began to move again, and color returned to the world around them, followed by sound and motion. Styx felt the tight grip on his heart relax. Rarity trembled. The crowd babbled in confusion. For the first time, ponies pushed to get away from the sphere, rather than toward it. The guard pony suddenly looked very serious.
What was that?
She had managed to stop shaking, though her voice was still weak and thready.
You wanted a timeless piece of art!
He seemed oblivious to the panic in the crowd, or the shocked reaction from Rarity.
This is it! Simply stop the sun in its orbit and time around you will cease to flow. This is the greatest thing I have ever crafted.
He stared at the armillary for a long moment, then turned to her.
Tell me, have I met your challenge? Will you accept my love?
She stared at him, shocked into silence. Styx squeezed his eyes shut.
Please,
He said.
just tell him the truth. Look at him. He won't stop.
Rarity looked between them, then at the armillary. It spun slowly next to the glassblower, its artificial suns shining with all the light of the true dawn behind them. Her face softened, and for a moment, Styx thought she would do the right thing. But then, her features hardened. The haughty indifference she had worn when they first met returned, and she stood. Styx choked back a sob.
This is timeless, I suppose.
She said to the glassblower.
And useful. And well crafted. All three of my criteria you have met.
A dreamy smile appeared on his face.
But
She continued.
where is its beauty? Where is its charm and grace? Craft me the most beautiful artwork this one last time, and I will promise you my heart.
It was music to the glassblower's ears. Styx pushed the workshop door open. As he had expected, the glassblower was still inside, working in the dark. He pushed his way in, careful not to trip on the random bits of junk littering the floor. The apprentices waited outside, too frightened to enter. The glassblower stood at his work table, mindlessly polishing a large sheet of glass, Neither spoke for a while. Styx wasn't even sure his friend was aware of his presence. He moved closer and saw that the sheet of glass appeared to be an oval mirror.
You're going to do this, then?
He said. It wasn't a question. If the glassblower heard him, he gave no sign. He continued to polish the mirror.
Just promise me that this is it. If she rejects you again, you come back here and you forget her. Keep the hummingbird if you want, but sell the comb. Your apprentices tell me they haven't been paid in weeks.
The glassblower mumbled something.
I don't need to sell the comb. Anyway.
His breath fogged the mirror for a moment, before the cold air sucked the moisture away.
What?
The glassblower looked up.
I said, we don't need to sell the comb. The palace gave me a fortune for the armillary.
After Rarity had rejected the glassblower's third offer, the guards had confiscated the sphere. The last Styx had heard, it was securely guarded deep within the palace, along with other magical artifacts too dangerous to leave at large. Styx scowled.
What about your apprentices, then? Did you just forget about them?
Bunch of whiners. Tell them the bits are under the counter, in a bag next to the flux.
Styx heard a rustle behind him, and knew the apprentices were already moving.
You shouldn't say that about them,
he said softly.
They've stuck with you these past months, despite all this.
The glassblower snorted.
It will be over soon. Once she sees this, there will be no more doubt. It will be over, Styx.
It's just a mirror. As flattering as it is, I don't think that's what she meant.
Oh, not just a mirror. Look.
The glassblower tossed his rag to the floor, where it joined a pile of dozens of others. He slid the mirror to the edge of the table and lifted it for Styx to see. The mirror didn't seem too special, he thought. He looked no different in it than he had that morning, looking into the bathroom mirror as he did every day. Tan coat, blonde mane, marionette cutie mark, long strings descending from the ceiling attached to his hooves and head. Absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. He leapt back in shock and looked up at the ceiling for the strings. Nothing but dark rafters and drifting dust. He glanced quickly down at his hooves, but they were bare as well.
What?
He looked back at the glassblower, who had turned the mirror around and was gazing into it.
By Celestia, what is that thing?
It's a perfect mirror,
the glassblower muttered.
It doesn't just reflect, it shows us as we are within. It shows the true us.
He sighed quietly and continued.
When I look in it, I see a pony as fragile as glass, blinded by love, ready to shatter at the slightest touch.
He reached a hoof up to touch his cheek and flinched, as though really about to break.
But I also see a happy pony, the happiest pony in the world, Styx, because all of his dreams are about to come true. At long last, Styx, all my dreams are about to come true.
Styx felt sick. The room seemed to spin for a moment before he recovered.
Don't do this,
he said.
That thing won't get you what you want. If we were meant to see inside ourselves, our eyes would already have that gift. Smash it, break it before it hurts someone.
The glassblower scoffed.
I knew you would say that. I knew you wouldn't understand. But when she looks into this and sees the beauty in her that I already see,
he reached up to lovingly touch the glass.
She will be mine.
The crowd at the market was as large as before, though it kept a respectful distance. For once, no ponies attempted to bother Styx or the glassblower as they waited. The large contingent of guards, sent from the palace specifically to keep everyone away from his artwork, might have had something to do with that. Styx had debated not showing up. He already knew what would happen. It was like watching a train wreck in slow motion. But the glassblower was his friend, and friendship meant being there for your friends, even when they hurt themselves. The mirror was on a simple wooden stand. Styx had insisted on covering it with a cloth, lest they start an unintentional riot simply carrying it in public. The glassblower hadn't minded. Indeed, he didn't seem aware of anything. Rarity arrived later than Styx expected, well after the sunrise. A pair of guards escorted her through the crowd, but left her to make her own way across the empty space to the glassblower. They could see she was already shaking. Her mane was frazzled and shapeless. She stopped a dozen feet away. She barely gave the two of them a glance before turning to the covered mirror. Styx could see she was biting her lip.
Lady Rarity,
the glassblower said.
Thank you for coming. At last, we can put all this behind us.
She gave him a terse nod. To Styx, she gave a questioning, almost frightened glance. He shook his head slightly.
You asked me for craftsmanship, utility, timelessness, and beauty.
The glassblower continued, oblivious to their silent exchange.
I spent days wondering how to craft the most beautiful work for you, when I realized the answer was always before me.
He whipped the cloth from the mirror with a flourish and stood back.
Look in the mirror and see.
Styx moved to her side before she could approach it. The glassblower gave him an annoyed glance, but didn't interfere.
Please don't do this,
he whispered to her.
Just tell him it was never a real challenge. Nothing good will come from looking in that mirror. Swallow your pride, tell him the truth, and leave. Please.
She gave him a pain-filled look, and for a moment he thought she might actually do it. But the arrogance returned to her face, and she turned away from him in disdain.
You flatter me,
she said to the glassblower as she approached the mirror.
but I see mirrors every day. There's nothing special about them.
She came to a stop before the looking-glass and stared. For a long moment, nothing happened. All were silent. All held their breaths in anticipation. The glassblower smiled as though he had already won. Styx felt a tendril of dread wrapping around his heart. Finally, her expression began to change, from haughty indifference to puzzlement, then to surprise, followed quickly by shock tinged with horror. She stepped away from the mirror, but could not free her gaze from its grasp.
What is this?
She choked out.
What are you showing me?
The glassblower frowned, puzzled. This wasn't what he had expected.
Beauty, of course,
he said.
It's a perfect mirror. It shows us as we truly are.
You lie!
She shouted. Her lips drew back, exposing her teeth. Her eyes narrowed dangerously.
There is nothing true about this.
She reared up and brought her hooves crashing down onto the mirror, knocking it from the stand onto the cold, hard cobblestones. A normal mirror would have shattered, but this was a special mirror. A perfect mirror. It clattered and came to rest with only a few chips along its edges. But Rarity was not done.
I am beautiful!
The cracks grew.
I am honest! I am true!
Again.
I am a good pony!
With a flash of light that left every pony momentarily blind, the mirror shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces. The glassblower stared at his broken creation, not moving, his mouth agape. Rarity sobbed quietly, her white legs marred with thin streaks of blood where flying bits of glass had cut her. Styx sank to his haunches, head low in defeat, mourning for 2 wounded hearts. Rarity never returned to the Canterlot Bazaar. The glassblower worked long into the evening. He worked as the tallow candles around him guttered and went out. He worked until the moon, high overhead, was the only motion in the night. Through the long night he worked, warmed by the hellish fires of his forge. For all his remaining years he worked, but never again did his creations truly live. Ever they were only glass, for they lacked the magic of love. He worked, and as he worked, the winter night outside was not half as cold as the winter in his heart.